Hello, are you here to debate?
Yep.
All right, what's your name, age, and pronouns?
Hi, my name is Drake Chambers. I am 23,
Did you
and
say
for the
Greg?
sec, Drake.
Drake. Okay, Drake. You said 23, and then what were your pronouns?
For the sake of this, he, him.
Okay, you don't go by he, him outside of this? Fair enough, G.
Yeah, not really.
Oh, okay. I go by I go by he, him everywhere, but fair enough. What are you here to debate about?
Mainly number 4, systemic racism is real.
Okay, do you not believe in systemic racism?
No, I'm really thinking about who doesn't think it's real.
Oh, wait, so you do believe that it's real?
In the sense that does it exist currently in the United States? No, but most parts of the world, yes.
You think systemic racism doesn't exist in the U.S.?
Used to, but not anymore.
Okay, when did it end?
About mid 60s, early 70s.
Mid 60s, early 70s, systemic racism was over. So what was all
Yes.
the rioting in the 80s in LA when white cops were beating black people up for no reason? What was that all about?
That was really about centralized racism, not really systemic racism as a whole.
The cops wouldn't be a systemic system?
Not necessarily in that area, no. Just centralized racist system in that area, not necessarily whole systemic like, say, a state or a country.
Cops would be a systemic part of our country, yeah. Do you think here, let me ask you a question. If I could prove to
Sure.
you that on a nationwide basis, police tend to be biased against black people, would you agree that systemic racism still exists?
Not necessarily systemic racism. Racism, yeah, but not systemic.
If an entire system is consistently employing people with biases, you wouldn't say that's a systemic problem?
Not necessarily, no. It's
Okay,
more about
how would you define systemic racism?
a broader term would be either a state or a government body within a state or a country that continues to uphold oppressive views on people who are a different race than the people who hold said power.
Yeah, I would just disagree with that fully. I would just define systemic racism as one individual race group oppressing another individual race group, whether through outright or implicit or not systems. So basically, systemically oppressing one group for the political, social, or economic gain of another group, which is definitely happening in the U.S.
Hmm. What do you want, girl? Sorry, my dog just came in. Hmm. That's an interesting way to look at it, but to me, systemic racism is or should be defined as something much more larger than small mini examples of real systemic racism.
I'm sorry, how would you determine whether something is happening on a systemic level?
Mainly a large groups or populations of people that all have similar experiences
Okay.
within a systematic.
So
What are you doing?
if large groups of black people are having a similar experience of being oppressed by the criminal justice system, for example, wouldn't you call this systemic racism then?
Yes, but how are they being oppressed currently?
Sure. Have you ever heard of the Veil of Darkness study?
I've heard, but I never looked into it.
Okay, let me just walk you through it
I
real
thought I
quick.
wanted to, but never did.
So Stanford decided to look at 95 million traffic stops across the US. What they did was they wanted to see, their essential thesis was, are black people targeted for traffic stops simply because they're black, right? They wanted to see if this was true or not. So what they did is they said, okay, let's look at pullover rates during the day. So as you know, and as I know, in most parts of the country, it becomes day and night at different times. So in the winter, nighttime tends to come earlier and the daytime tends to be shorter. So they said, let's take a time where people are on the road, where in some times of the year it's day and sometimes it's at night, and let's see what happens. And what they found is that during the day, when the sun is up, black people get pulled over 16 times more than white people. So like it's like 16 times higher rate of pullover. And at nighttime, when you can no longer see the color of the person driving the car, those rates even out. What would be the explanation for this if it was not for a system of implicit bias against black bodies?
I want to say it's literally systemic, more just racism as a whole. Not
But
really
you said in
systemic.
order to make it systemic, it would need to be a large group. Would analyzing 95 million traffic stops not tell us like a large group, right? That's like 1/3 of the U.S. population in traffic stops.
Yeah, but by large, I mean either like a single country in itself. How much of that population is actually being targeted without justifiable reason?
What would the
Just on the basis of
justify?
a
What would the
different color,
justifiable
not black,
reason?
not related to a specific color that they are
Sure.
being
What
targeted.
would be the justifiable reason for black people being pulled over in traffic stops more?
I had this conversation with my uncle who is black and some of my black coworkers. Here's the gist. A lot of people are automatically wary of black people because black people commit more crimes.
Well, they don't.
I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's wrong to do that. I'm just saying that is one big reason why people do that.
So really quickly, when we're looking at especially traffic violations, black people don't commit more crimes. Like the only time you're going to see a bigger distribution of black people in crime is violent crime. Black people are arrested more, but that's not saying that they commit more crimes. It's saying they're arrested more for crimes. Black people are also falsely arrested more and exonerated more.
True. But not all traffic stops have to do with traffic violations. They can also deal with
Well, here's
warrants.
the beauty. Here's the beauty of the Veil of Darkness study. They accounted for that, and they took out all stops that led to a criminal charge. And do you know what happened? The rate stayed the same. It was still 16 times higher for black people, and that rate evened out at nighttime. So how do you account for this when they're not looking at stops where black people are committing offenses?
That's very interesting. I guess I want to know how to break that down there.
Here's another one I have for you. The United States Sentencing Commission, which analyzes basically every criminal sentencing in the United States, has found that black people receive prison sentences 13 times longer and harsher than their white counterparts. What would be the explanation for that? Because they have those numbers, even when we look at same type of crime, same type of offense, and same socioeconomic background. So what would be the reason?
How many times have you committed the same crime?
They account for first-time offenders as well.
All right. So what's the breakdown of the black people who did the same crime multiple times, or the same crime only once.
No,
Does it have that?
they're looking. You can take first time offenders coming from the same socioeconomic background with zero criminal history, and we're still going to see a larger distribution of Black people experiencing longer and harsher sentences, even when we account for all of those things. What would be the reason for this if not some type of inherent racism in our criminal justice system?
Of course, there's inherent racism in the criminal justice system, but
Hold on. Say that sentence one more time. Wait. Say that sentence one more time, friend.
Of course, there's inherent racism due to the country's past, but to say that
wait.
country as a whole is that way,
You're saying,
that way,
hold on, friend. If you're saying that there is inherent racism within our criminal justice system, then Drake, you just described systemic racism. There is inherent racism baked into the system of criminal justice within our country. That's systemic racism.
Not in a way to where they're still making laws like Jim Crow.
Systemic racism isn't saying that there needs to be inherent laws on the books. It's saying that the systems have to use whatever tools at their disposal to oppress one racial group for the political, social, or economic benefit of another.
Because they bend and break their own codes of ethics and laws in order to impress people.
They do this all the time. What do you mean? The government breaks its own ethics rules all the time.
Like, that's not really the system itself being racist. The people within the system trying to bring back those laws.
The people within the system are what makes the system. You can't have a system without people operating it. And I would argue that a system that consistently allows for... Wait, really quickly. I would say that a system that consistently allows for racist people to be placed in seats of power is a racist system. Would you not agree with this? Like what?
Yes,
I would say if a system wasn't systemically racist, why would it allow for racist people to be put in charge?
Because it more has to do with corruption rather than inherently systemic racism.
Is it corruption if this was the way the system was designed to work?
The system wasn't designed to work like that. It was years and years of bending and mounting it to where it would just not really.
When America was created, like let's just transport our minds back to 1776 for a second. There's poop in the roads from horses. Toilets aren't the way they are now. And unfortunately, Pokemon doesn't exist. Let's just transport our minds there for a second. When the founding fathers created this country, did they own slaves?
Yeah.
Did
because
they want
slavery
to?
Was the norm.
Yeah. Did they make any strides towards freeing the slaves?
Oh yeah, George Washington.
George Washington owned slaves until the day he died, and then passed those slaves on to his wife.
He freed 14 of them.
Cool. He still owned slaves until the day he died, and then passed them on to his wife. Good for him for freeing a couple of them. But I'm just going to throw this out there. Like, freeing a couple people doesn't absolve you from owning said people. If slavery
wasn't looked as a racial thing, it was more like a society norm.
No, it was absolutely a racial thing. That's why in a lot of slave codes, yes, it was. In slave codes, it was specifically written that the Negro would be the slave. It was in the laws in America that the slave would be Negro and nobody else would be slave. Yes, it was quite literally in the books.
I think you're misunderstanding. By racial, I mean like racial authority or racial oppression. The only slave they could get was Negro or black because that was the African slave trade at the time.
Because we made laws saying that the only slaves we could own were Negroes.
Because they were the cheapest.
Because they were all that we could own.
Afford.
Not afford, own. If it wasn't a racial thing, there would have been white slaves too, but there weren't.
Well, there weren't white slaves in the United States.
There were no.
Well,
there,
tell me.
I won't say
technically
no.
they were.
I won't say no, but there's like you're very rarely, if at all, gonna find a place that enslaved white people simply because they were white. Black people were enslaved simply because we were black.
Actually, that's a complete misunderstanding of slavery history.
It is not.
Black people weren't enslaved because they were black.
Yes, they were.
They were enslaved because they were vulnerable.
No, they weren't. No, it was because they were black. The initial creation of the black slave in like some of our earliest onsets of this in history was done by the Greeks under, I want to say it was Aristotle, who wrote that black people were to be subservient to white people because of the sun, because the sun cooked their brains to the point where black bodies were inferior to white bodies. Everywhere that has had black slaves has justified it in the means of black people being inferior. You're not really going to find any examples of white people being enslaved simply because they're white. You might find examples of them being enslaved because they were another type of culture, but typically those were enslavements by other white people.
So the Ottomans, the Turkish, Africans, are they white people?
The Turks? I don't know. I'd probably call Turkish people. I'd probably say Turkish people are mostly white. Yeah. Yeah, I would look at it. Yeah, I'm looking at pictures of a Turkish person. Yeah, I'd say that's a white man. Yeah.
Yeah, they the Islamic rule over
absolutely.
The Ottoman Empire and Turkey, they owned white slaves because of the fact they were white and Christian. They saw them as vulnerable.
They enslaved them because they were Christian. They enslaved more than just white people. I'd say that's a white man for sure. But yeah. Like, again, when you're looking at these things, you're going to see enslavement of more than just white bodies. So, for instance, Egyptians took their own people as slaves, right? They weren't enslaving someone simply because that person was, right? We're going to see this in Islamic countries, too. We're going to see this in African countries where they took their own people as slaves. So the slavery, right? So the slavery of the transatlantic slave trade, completely different, because the transatlantic slave trade specifically says the Negro body is the slave. In fact, it was illegal to make white people slaves. Black people, though, were bought and sold as property. And my whole premise of this is you said, well, the system wasn't designed this way, but it was. When America was formed, it was formed under the foundational understanding that black bodies were property. We were not included in the Bill of Rights. We were not included in the Declaration of Independence. We were not included in these things. So yes, the country has always been built off of black oppression. And it still is, and it still operates this way. So when you say, well, systemic racism can't exist, or I won't say can't exist, systemic racism, the system wasn't built this way, I would say it absolutely was built this way.
Then that's just a complete misunderstanding on how this country came to be, because it wasn't necessarily built by black people. It was built by those who saw a means to an end of British slavery and colonialism.
The only reason why America was prosperous. I need you to understand something, Drake. The only reason American was prosperous is because it utilized free labor at its start. It's the only reason we were able to become an economic powerhouse is because we utilized free labor. The only reason the South was able to... What did you say?
Slavery wasn't even that viable. In the Civil War, people were still fighting for slavery. Slavery itself wasn't even that helpful towards the economy
Yes,
of
it
the
was.
United States. It was
Yes, it
not.
was, friend.
That's actually a misconception.
It is not.
It was not that viable at all.
It was.
Of course, slave labor itself, you would think it is, but reality at such a large scale of this country, it really didn't help.
Yes, it did. Like I don't even know how to have this conversation. The South was quite literally fighting to keep slavery because it was so economically beneficial for them. They had an entire workforce. What was the major export of the South in the 1800s?
It was cotton.
Mm-hmm. And the United States produced, if my numbers are correct, which they are, 75% of the world's cotton, utilizing slave labor. That's incredibly economically beneficial.
Majority of farms used their own labor, not slave labor, because slaves were expensive for a lot of people in the South.
The majority of cotton farms use slave labor.
Nope. The majority of cotton farms do not use slave labor.
Yes,
only the
did.
bigger, richer ones use slave labor.
Nope. The majority of them use slave labor. Here, I'll pull the number for you. Hold on. Here we go. By 1860, 75 to 80% of all cotton produced in the United States came from farms that use slave labor. Now, I don't know about you, but I learned in math that 75 to 80% is a majority. So we were producing 75% of the world's cotton, and 80% of that production was done via slave labor. So yes, the United States was built off of the backs of Black oppression and systemic racism. That's how the country was built. So the country is going to always default to that. That being said, someone did pay to move on, so I'm going to move on. You have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Everybody say W to Sebastian. Bro, we were really about to have the states' rights argument about the Civil War? Dog. Like, no way.